The movies have always been a mix of artistry and business sense. While Adolf Zukor, Carl Laemmle, Jesse Lasky, William Fox, and Samuel Goldwyn were building entertainment empires, D.W. Griffith was establishing himself as the industry's creative leader. With the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War approaching in 1915, movies about the bloody battles between North and South were increasing. Griffith began developing plans for the most ambitious and innovative of them all, The Birth of a Nation, based on The Klansman, a novel and play by ardent Southerner Thomas Dixon, Jr.
Griffith was clearly a man with a big future. I look back now and I realize that although this seemed like a golden opportunity, it was also a recipe for disaster. Because anyone who put up front money for this picture without really knowing how an audience would take to it, would they line up? Would they buy reserved seats? Would they pay in advance? Would they sit still for 2 hours? It was a big question mark. Birth of a Nation, a big question mark.
I don't think there's anything you can say today to give people a sense of what a lightning bolt The Birth of a Nation was for audiences at the time. It took the country by storm. I mean, there were people lined up for months to see the film, and it was playing in major theaters at a $2 top admission. This when most movie theaters had a 25-cent top admission.
Griffith boasted about his concern for historical accuracy, but not every American cheered as the Ku Klux Klan rode to the rescue in the film's stirring climax.
D.W. Griffith was from Kentucky, and so you had the viewpoint of people who had come out of the defeated South, who had heard stories of the old South and of its grandeur, its power, and its beauty. And so Griffith felt that he was really presenting history.
The Birth of a Nation was less history and more a distorted lament for a lost cause.
The NAACP was formed in 1909. This organization now was really going to fight for the rights of African Americans, and it was going to speak out against injustices and inequities. White liberals were disturbed and spoke out about this film. Jane Addams, the great social reformer at Hull House in Chicago, spoke out and wrote about this film. Rabbi Stephen Wise spoke out against the film.
There were violent confrontations in Boston and calls to censor the film in cities such as Pittsburgh and Chicago, protesting the glorification of the Klan and degrading images of African Americans.
I mean, these images are absolutely shocking, but they fit into this story and the case that D.W. Griffith was building, that these Black men had to be controlled. They had to be put back into their place. All they could bring would be disorder and chaos.
At the time, most white Americans, including Griffith, remained blind or supportive of the racist imagery, even at the highest levels of American society.
Thomas Dixon knew exactly how to promote this film. He persuaded Woodrow Wilson to screen the film at the White House. So here suddenly we have the first time a motion picture being shown at the White House of the President of the United States.
Wilson was very excited about it. Other members of his staff who saw it there in the White House were excited by this film. And Wilson said it's like writing history with lightning.
Dixon then approached the U.S. Supreme Court. He knew that the head of the Supreme Court had been a member of the Klan.
Dixon proudly reported the Chief Justice's admiration for Griffith's visually innovative representation of the war. But The Birth of a Nation was a success even without such claims of high-level support. When it toured the country, the movie traveled with a full orchestra, playing an original score, with a team of sound effects specialists to enhance the battle scenes. It was a movie phenomenon unlike anything seen before.
The fact that it was such a commercial success. Many people felt that it really led to the creation of Hollywood itself, because Hollywood was not really Hollywood at that point. I think that in looking at Birth of a Nation today, we have to see its importance in the history of American movies, and also Griffith's position as this major American filmmaker who took movies in a new direction technically, and in the art of telling a story and telling it for a large audience. It's a masterpiece, but a racist masterpiece.
The success of The Birth of a Nation made D.W. Griffith world famous. It also changed the life of enterprising New England theater and film exchange owner Louis B. Mayer. Using the enormous profits from exhibiting Griffith's film, Mayer was able to move from showing movies to making them. In 1918, he established his own low-budget production facility in Los Angeles, located on the grounds of the old Selig studio and zoo.
Mission Road was a really lower-class neighborhood, so you could get something pretty cheap there, and Selig Zoo actually was a zoo with a lot of animals.
In business as Louis B. Mayer Productions, the former scrap metal dealer knew little about making motion pictures.
He had a fifth-grade education. The only way he could learn was by observing and asking, why is the camera there? Why is the lighting over here? Why aren't you going to a close-up? How come you're going to that close-up? He was a nudge, and he drove everybody nuts.
Mayer learned fast. He had to.
The movies grow faster than probably any commercial form of recreation that I can think of in American history. Imagine when you're showing the first actualities at the turn of the century, you have a few hundred people viewing it. By 1910, you have 26 million people going a year, roughly a quarter of the population. By 1914, virtually every city in America that has a population of more than 4,000 people has a movie theater. America goes movie crazy.
By 1916, there were approximately 21,000 movie theaters in the United States, with an average seating capacity of 500. Theater owners such as Marcus Lowe, a former furrier, had an essential piece of the action. In Chicago, the Balaban and Katz chain was emerging as a dominant force in the Midwest. They courted moviegoers with something new.
They were very concerned because the movie business was a seasonal business. You don't think about it now, but you didn't go to the movies, or the Nickelodeon anyway. You couldn't go in the summer because in order to see these movies, you had to darken everything. So you couldn't keep doors open, you couldn't keep windows open. It was stiflingly hot. So it came June, July, August, and into September. You couldn't have the business. There was nothing you could do with the space. Uncle Barney had ice. This was a big thing. So my uncle started the first air-cooled indoor movie theater because they had big blocks of ice and they would blow fans over it. In the beginning, it was a real issue because the fans worked pretty well, but they were very, very noisy. And also, occasionally, the ice would start to melt, the fan would get out of control, and all the patrons would be splashed with icy cold water, which was also a problem. But they worked it out, and eventually they were basically responsible for the first air-conditioned theaters.
As they appealed to more upscale audiences, theater owners began building lavish moving picture palaces. The Strand on Broadway in New York City cost $1 million. At the time, it was the most lavish movie theater ever built. It sat nearly 3,000 people. In Los Angeles, Sid Grauman, son of a San Francisco theater owner, failed as a prospector during the 1890s Alaska gold rush, but he struck it rich with grand movie palaces such as the $1 Million, and in the 20s, the Egyptian and the Chinese on Hollywood Boulevard. Theater magnate Marcus Lowe declared, "We're selling tickets to theaters, not to movies. Without theaters, movies were just cans of film." Treated like royalty in the first picture palaces, audiences could be demanding. They wanted bigger, better, and more. But that didn't necessarily mean an end to a taste for old-fashioned entertainment. Ambitious and innovative D.W. Griffith found this out with Intolerance, a production that dwarfed The Birth of a Nation in both aspiration and budget. Interweaving stories from 4 periods of history, Intolerance was complex and sophisticated. Griffith was reaching to position movies beside the grandest novels, plays, and operas. The film's massive set for ancient Babylon, erected on a Hollywood street corner, was a towering symbol of his ambition.
Intolerance didn't really do that well, and it didn't really do very much for Griffith's career. It may seem very naive to us today because we can understand these 4 stories, we understand what's going on. But back then, audiences didn't expect to have multiple storylines in the same film, and they really just didn't get it.
Once again, Griffith was ahead of his time. By 1916, paying for the contracts of popular stars like Chaplin and Pickford made movie production increasingly expensive. To cost-conscious William Fox, the answer was to manufacture his own stars from scratch. His most successful creation was mysterious Theda Bara.
Theda Bara was one of those people who was developed inside the movies with a personality and a persona that was manufactured, the vamp.
In 1915, Fox ballyhooed his new star as the love child of a French artist and his Egyptian mistress. Her name was an anagram for Arab death. The fact that she was really Theodosia Goodman, the daughter of a tailor from Cincinnati, was the real mystery of her past. Even if some in the audience were in on the charade, they relished Theda Bara as one of the first movie sex symbols. "Kiss me, my fool," she hissed in her first hit, A Fool There Was, and audiences were thrilled. A less exotic and more hometown American image was provided by dashing Douglas Fairbanks. On stage since 1900, Fairbanks was an established movie star by 1916, specializing in contemporary entertainments.
He was sunny and funny and active. He was American. He was everything that the era was about. He was about getting ahead, about going forward, about climbing the ladder, changing yourself, becoming a success.
With movies from stars like Douglas Fairbanks, Theda Bara, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin, Hollywood movie makers offered audiences amusing diversions. But not all was sweetness and light in early 20th century America. A few filmmakers sought box office success by portraying harsher realities.
They're looking to the headlines of the day. They're saying, what's going on in America right now? And they're taking those headlines and they're making movies about child labor. They're making movies about the exploitation of women in sweatshops. What we call social issue films are being shown every week in movie theaters for the first decade and a half of American cinema.
In 1915, producer, director, writer, and actor Lois Weber made the movie parable Hypocrites. Audiences were shocked by her depiction of female nudity, literally the naked truth. But she also exposed the role of sex, greed, and grasping power in American life. More entertainment-oriented movie makers shied away from such fare. Even with dollops of sex and sensationalism, such films were considered box office poison, a sure way to lose money. Adolf Zucker complained to socially conscious filmmakers, "You're picking my pocket." Despite this, Carl Laemmle agreed to distribute Traffic in Souls, an expose of the illicit practice of luring innocent immigrant girls into prostitution. Universal's first full-length feature, the film opened on Broadway in New York and was a huge success. A mix of sensationalism and outrage, reformers applauded its message. And more important to an immigrant audience, many of whom were not fluent in English, it had special relevance and power. The persuasive power of the movies was recognized early. In 1916, faced with prospects of an expanding war in Europe, Thomas Ince produced Civilization, one of the first American film epics, and an anti-war plea for peace. But it was too late. After hesitating for years, the United States entered the conflict in April of 1917. Studio newsreels captured moving images of wartime action, while movie makers such as D.W. Griffith enthusiastically made films to support the war effort. The German Enemy was a boon to a struggling bit player and production assistant to D.W. Griffith on The Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. His name was Erich von Stroheim, or at least that's what he said.
He claimed to be an Austrian aristocrat, when in actuality he was the son of a poor Jewish milliner. He was pretending to be something he wasn't all the time. This is a man for whom he strove to be this incredible aristocrat, all the while half of him despising anybody who would be impressed by that.
In the Heart of Humanity, playing a Prussian officer, Stroheim rapes a young mother and throws her child out the window. He became the man you love to hate, a lurid on-screen justification for war and defeat of the German Hun. While Hollywood was supporting the war effort with flag-waving and virulent anti-German films, movie stars like Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks proved their loyalty during massive war bond tours. $17 billion was raised. It was clear politicians benefited from star power, but the movies needed politicians too. Beginning as early as the 1890s, filmmakers faced repeated calls for censorship from states and cities such as Chicago and Boston, and even New York, where Nickelodeons had been banned for a brief time.
There's a long history, starting in 1916, when Congress held hearings whether there should be a federal board of censorship to get involved in censoring movies. The movie industry leaders have always done everything they could to keep Washington out of their business. And indeed, they were funneling money into Democratic and Republican campaigns as early as 1915. They basically announced any politician in America who would oppose censorship openly, they would give campaign funds for.
The mix of Hollywood power, movies, politics, and propaganda had just begun. With the armistice of 1918, the United States and its European allies were the winners of World War I. But victory for the American movie industry was even more decisive. Until 1914, Europe dominated international filmmaking. Headquartered in Paris, the Pathé Company operated the world's largest film studio. And Italian epics set lavish production standards. The disruption and devastation of war changed that. By the end of the conflict, the United States was the source of more than 80% of the world's films and supplied 98% of movies shown in America. In hardly more than 20 years, the American motion picture business had evolved from a cheap novelty to the country's fifth largest industry, after agriculture, transportation, oil, and steel. And it seemed to happen in less than the flicker of a frame of film. By 1920, the era of the first inventive engineers and peep show entrepreneurs was over, and many of those who led the way had been left behind. Georges Méliès, the magical French innovator, had been forced to sell his Paris studio and slipped into obscurity. he ended up selling toys in a Paris train station. W.K.L. Dixon, who had developed the first movie machine with Thomas Edison, had a brief career as a producer of news films, but the business passed him by. The Lumiere brothers, who had pioneered projected movies in the 1890s, abandoned film production in favor of developing new motion picture equipment. Edwin S. Porter, who brought stories to movie screens in the early 1900s, also returned to his machinist roots and was largely forgotten. Alice Guy made her last movie in 1920 and returned to France, where she worked as a writer. Even Thomas Edison, the man who began it all, dropped out of filmmaking in 1918. He never felt comfortable in the new world of entertainment. The birth of the movies in America set the stage for an era of energy, ambition, and sometimes disconcerting social change. By 1920, the full flowering of the silent film and the first grand era of moguls and movie stars was about to begin.